Good evening, everyone. My name is Frank Harvey. I am the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at Dalhousie University. Welcome to the 2019 Halifax International Security Forum, Dalhousie St. Mary's University Roundtable. This year's title, Populism Peaked, the Future of Democracy. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that the McInnes Room, the Student Union Building, Dalhousie University, and our entire community benefit from and sit on Mi'kmaq, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. Treaties the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey rights and established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. We here at Dalhousie are very grateful for our partnerships, our friendships across Dalhousie, grateful for our elders and residents, our community leaders, our Indigenous Advisory Council. We're grateful for our faculty's expanding Indigenous Studies program. We're very grateful for our faculty's new Canada Research Chair in Reconciliation, Gender and Identity, Professor Margaret Robinson. We will continue to work on and build on these critically important relationships and friendships because we are all treaty people and we take these words very seriously. Wilalio. I'd like to start by listing what I think are a few of the more relevant and maybe arguably disturbing conclusions from the 2019 Freedom in the World report published by Freedom House, just to set the stage for the discussion this evening. Quote, freedom in the world has recorded global declines in political rights and civil liberties for an alarming 13 consecutive years from 2005 to 2018. During the same 13-year period, countries with net scored declines have consistently outnumbered those with net improvements, a reversal of what we were seeing in the years after the Berlin Wall came down. On average, countries that earned a status upgrade between 1988 and 2005 have faced an 11% drop in their numerical score during the 13 years of decline. These declines have touched all parts of the world. Every region except Asia Pacific has a lower average score for 2018 than it did in 2005. Of the 41 countries that were consistently ranked free from 1985 to 2005, 22 have registered net score declines in the last 5 years. And finally, in 2018, a total of 68 countries suffered net declines in political rights and civil liberties, with only 50 registering gains. The report also raised serious concerns about the health of American democracy, the stability of its constitutional system, the weakening of fundamental checks and balances, and the declining adherence by American leaders to the most basic principles of the rule of law. So the wave of hope and optimism following the post-Cold War democratization across Europe is now, I would argue, being replaced by a sweeping global sense of despair for the future of democratic governments, despair in light of the rise of illiberal populism and a resurgence of authoritarian rule. Democracies are being subjected to open revolt by significant sections of their own populations. Populist parties and demagogues appear to be making a pretty deep set of inroads in the political mainstream. So what better time to engage in serious and informed discussion about the legacy and the future of democratic governance, particularly when the leaders, the democratic leaders and the institutions and the states that we typically rely on to defend and promote those core principles are failing. When these pivotal countries are led by officials who ignore basic social and political norms while exploiting racial tensions, intolerance, division, exclusion, nationalism, isolationism, populism, and self-interest. So, what awaits us in the 2020s? Has populism peaked, or is this just the beginning? I am delighted to welcome the distinguished delegates who you'll be meeting very soon from the 11th Halifax International Security Forum, including the forum's Peace and Women Fellows, for a panel discussion on the future of populism and democratic governments. And I want to thank the panelists, Emily Lau, Tolu Ongunlesi, Roderick Kiesewetter, Professor Janice Stein, and our moderator, who is also the vice president of the Halifax International Security Forum, Robin Shepherd. Robin will be out very soon to introduce the speakers. I want to take a few seconds, though, to insert a brief footnote before we begin. My area of teaching is international relations and international politics, international conflict, US foreign policy. I attended McGill hundreds of years ago in the early 80s as an undergrad, and I had no real clue what I wanted to study. Around second year, when I took this incredible course by an amazing professor, a course on international relations. And I loved it. And I took a few more, and I went on to do an MA in international relations and international security, on to a PhD, came to Dal in 1992, taught similarly large international relations classes, went on to become chair, and now dean, and I now have the privilege of introducing incredible roundtables like this. That professor, so many years ago, was Janice Stein, who's on the stage. So I want to thank her, of course, for coming. So now I want to introduce Robin Shepherd, who will serve tonight as the moderator. Mr. Shepherd is vice president at the Halifax International Security Forum, a British citizen. Robin has been a senior journalist and think tank analyst for many years. Among the highlights of his career, he has been the head of the Europe program of Chatham House, the Moscow bureau chief for the Times of London, and the author of 2 previous books, A State Beyond the Pale, Europe's Problem with Israel, and Czechoslovakia, The Velvet Revolution, and Beyond. Thank you all for coming. Robin, thank you very much for serving as the moderator.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Frank, and thank you to Dalhousie University for hosting us. Once again, it's a real pleasure to be here in Halifax. My name, as I say, is Robin Shepherd. I'm the Vice President of Halifax International Security Forum. This is our 11th year. I promise you, by the way, I'm only going to speak for a minute or two because I know you want to actually hear from the panellists, who I'll introduce just as they're coming in. The Halifax International Security Forum is different from most of the major international conferences in that it has a very clear mission, which is to strengthen strategic cooperation among the world's democracies. And security is something that we define broadly. We will, this weekend, as we have done in weekends before, be talking about the whole range of issues. You may know that Cindy McCain, the wife of the late great Senator John McCain, is a member of our board. Cindy McCain, for example, is somebody who has devoted a lot of her life and continues to devote her life to the fight against human trafficking. That, to us, is a security issue. Clearly, climate change is a major security issue. The place of countries like Canada and Great Britain and Germany and Korea and Japan, how we can fit into the global architecture in a way that makes a difference to make the world a better place. And then, of course, the great power rivalry. The United States of America and increasingly China. Russia is, to my mind at least, more of a spoiler on the international stage. It's a significant player, but clearly the real action in terms of great power rivalry these days is the United States and China. And you'll see this weekend that we are featuring discussion of China and how the Western world should respond to Xi Jinping and China's rise and how we should interpret it. And that will be something which we shall be discussing at the conference. And of course, as we speak today, and one of our main speakers, one of the speakers at the conference and one of the speakers this evening, events are continuing to unfold in Hong Kong. We don't know where it's going to end up. We do know that it's a challenging situation for everybody on the ground. It's a challenging situation for China. It's not 100% clear that China knows exactly what to do. We've also seen, as many of you will know, in the United States this week, the United States Senate unanimously passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. the House of Representatives then passed by 417 to 1. I think the 1 was some Republican congressman somewhere lost in the midst of America somewhere. I don't know what the 1 was doing. But in any case, it's veto-proof. So regardless of whether President Trump wants to sign it, it looks like he's going to sign it. And this is a big deal. I think certainly I'm always on a learning curve about the United States of America and its civics and how the different branches of government actually make a difference. But actually the Senate and the House are very powerful foreign policy players. And the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is a huge deal. And I think we'll see the Chinese authorities responding quite robustly in the days to come. Okay, that's certainly enough from me. What I wanted to do is introduce our panelists this evening. They're from different parts of the world. As you see, the discussion is entitled Populism Peaked, the future of... I'll move over here to where I'm going to be sitting. Emily, do you want to sit there? Thank you. Populism Peaked, the future of democracy. That has all the hallmarks of a very North American, European kind of discussion. And obviously that's an important part of the whole debate. But as you can see, and as you can see when you look at your program, we have people also from Nigeria and from Hong Kong. From Nigeria, we have Tolu Ogunlesi, who last year was it last year you were on the panel with me? Made a tremendous contribution. Tolu is a great friend of the conference, and it's an absolute delight to have you back here in Halifax. Tolu is the special assistant to the President of Nigeria on digital and new media, and the head of the Presidency Office of Digital Engagement. Clearly Tolu is able to provide a perspective from Africa, which is very different, where populism, and we were discussing this before, populism isn't necessarily a word that's much used in the Nigerian context, so we're going to be also widening this to talk about democracy and the future of democracy in the world, in parts of the world where it's certainly being challenged, or it's a continuing challenge to entrench democracy. With that in mind, another guest who's not from North America or Europe is Emily Lau, sitting to my right here. Emily's made the trip all the way from Hong Kong, and it's a delight to have you here, Emily. Emily was a member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council from 91 to 97. And 98 to 2016, was the first woman directly elected to LegCo, Legislative Council. You promised to put me right if I get it wrong. Me right?
LegCo.
LegCo, okay, so there's my first mistake. Emily is going to be speaking on our panels, one of our panels tomorrow. And we can also discuss another matter that I'll let you talk about it, a prize on Saturday morning, if you like, at some point during the discussion. Janice Stein is a homegrown Canadian, and Janice is the Bellsbow Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science and the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and an honorary foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here, Janice. Finally, from Germany, it's a great pleasure to have Roderick Kiesewetter, right at the end there next to Janice. Roderick is a member of the German Bundestag. He first became a member in 2009, if I'm correct, and was re-elected in 2017. And since 2014, that's for the last 5 years, he's been the special representative for foreign affairs of the CDU-CSU group. So that's the group associated with the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. And CSU, I won't delve too far into German politics, but CSU is always referred to as the Bavarian sister party, correct, of the CDU.
Strong sister.
Pardon me?
Strong sister.
Strong sister party. Very good. Okay, well, Populism Peaked, the future of democracy. Tolu was asking me, and I think that we may actually start with this, and since Janice is the political scientist, I'm going to throw this to her first. Let's just get a little working definition of what we mean by populism.
So populism has so many definitions, but let's just agree that we'll use this one rather than spend our time talking about what it means. It is generally used by, in the name of we the pure people who are revolting against, and revolting is quite the right word here with the double entendre. We are revolting against corrupt elites. They can be financial elites, they can be political elites, institutional elites, who have rigged the system against we the people. So one of the ways that I know I'm in the presence of a populist leader is when he or she uses that language in opposition to the existing institutional structure.
Right, and let's be clear, this is one of the things, that just because a populist said something, it doesn't in itself make it wrong. I mean, there is a
Or right.
Right, and that there is a problem with corruption in the elites.
Yes.
So just because somebody talks about corruption in our elites, that is not a negative thing. It's not something we should then say, oh, this is just a populist remark. However, it's something that you say is emblematic of the way populists speak.
And the added dimension to this, Robin, and you've talked about this too, is this language of purity. Mm-hmm. So it's not only that there is corruption among elites, and we certainly see that, but there is an elevation of that. We are pure, we the people are pure, and the corrupt elites are not. It's that element of purity in the discussion which is so characteristic of populism.
Roderick, in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland is a party that started out as being pretty much a Eurosceptic party, if I'm not wrong, but then they mutated in response to Angela Merkel's decision to allow in 1 million refugees. I mean, this is a potted history that outsiders seem to believe is the case. Is that what happens? And also, do they talk in the manner that Janice is describing? Do they talk about the purity of the people versus the corrupt elites? Is that really on the ground how this thing works?
Yeah. She's really quite right with that. Until 2015, populism was not very popular in Germany. Populism was a word which we apprehended for other countries, not for Germany. When the migration peaked in 2015, the Alternative for Germany, a small party at that time, changed its attitude. They were very Eurosceptic, but then they were against migration. And they succeeded, especially in Eastern Germany. The number of migrants in that area is less than 1% of the population, but they gained about 30%, 35% in domestic elections. So the change was in 2015, where we, normal citizens, thought to be helpful, but those who felt left behind aligned themselves with the so-called Alternative for Germany, and this was the change in our politics. And also in our parliament, we have about 700 members in the parliament. Nearly 100 of them are from the so-called Alternative for Germany, and they now became very right-wing and very populist right-wing. They talk about the 12 years of National Socialism dictatorship, and also about the Shoah as a dirt from birds on the German history. So they try to relativate all that what we have achieved in the last 70 years. So this is the change in our domestic policies, that they try to bring up words which were forbidden or which were under suspicion, and they changed dramatically the public journalism. They changed a lot also of the other parties. We all became more radicalized in our words.
Right, and that's one of the and there are so many issues to discuss about populism. But one of the concerns that many people express is that when the populist parties are seen to be gaining traction and getting in popularity, this incentivizes parties, and populists can be either of the right or the left, and whichever side is in the centre-left or centre-right gets pulled either to the right or to the left. And I mean, you're part of CDU-CSU, so this might be a bit of a tough question, but I mean, is the CDU being pulled to the right?
No, I don't think so, because we are quite center-middle, but we have some interesting politicians who try to align with some AfD ideas to try to convince people in the right-wing area. I'm completely against it, Angela Merkel and some others as well, because they are the original, and if we try to copy them, we will lose. Therefore, the vast majority of our party is very close to the center, but we need to be aware that those people who align themselves with the Alternative for Germany, they feel left behind. So we have to invest much more into education and vocational training. We have to offer on the countryside more opportunities for them. So this makes the difference.
Right. We're certainly going to come back to all of these points. I'm just trying to sort of just introduce some thoughts into the discussion, and then we'll keep coming back, and we'll certainly bring you guys in as well to ask your own questions. Tolu, when you, and also this is the same question really to you, Emily, and we're going to certainly come to Hong Kong, and we're certainly going to come to Nigeria and democracy in Nigeria and in your region. But when you look at the discussion, look and listen to the discussion in Europe and North America these days, what do you think? Because Europe and the United States and North America used to be so confident, right? It was very clear that we had the model. I mean, in fact, in 1989, in fact 1991, Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous book which was entitled The End of History and The Last Man, but everybody remembers The End of History. And it was very clear, the template was there. It was the template of the political economic model of Western Europe and North America from 1989, and that was it. And it applied to you, whether you like it or not. It applied everywhere else, and that was that. So when you look at what's going on in Europe and North America, what do you guys think in Nigeria?
Well, it's very interesting to watch. It's interesting to watch the West kind of come to terms with something that's typically been associated with sort of, say, Africa, and to see that struggle in how did we get here? There's almost the temptation to say, welcome to our world. It actually is, it's quite interesting to watch, to see how the media, civil society, everybody is, that befuddlement, but it's something we have been, we are quite used to in our part of the world. But it also feels to me like the discussions are almost in one sense a luxury that democracies with ideology can enjoy. A lot of the conversation now has talked about sort of Eurosceptic party, center right, left, right, and all that. Those are terms that don't resonate with me as a Nigerian. Democracy is so young. We're going to be 60 years since independence next year. Only half of that has been democracy. And only in the last 20 years have we had the longest unbroken stretch of democracy, ever. So we haven't even evolved to a level of ideology. It's still basically parties that could, in one sense, each one could pass for the other. Defections are common, So it feels to me like for us, the future first, or the immediate future, is some sense of an emerging ideology. First, we'll get into this ideology, where people will define their political leanings based on how they feel about, issues. We're still not quite there yet. It just feels like, what we need to be doing now is to develop first. Get electricity, get, the basic things. And then get to the luxury of ideology, and then get to a stage where we can then talk about sort of like, populist behavior.
But has it also shifted the terms of discussion in that countries like Nigeria, quite specifically, have obviously been the subject of great plans by the IMF, the World Bank, and major international institutions. And, you know, if countries like Nigeria are going to follow that, obviously there's money involved, but credibility has to be behind that. So has this harmed the credibility of the Western model in the eyes of Nigerian Democrats?
Absolutely, absolutely. In any case, sort of the IMF and the World Bank have never exactly had very good reputations in Nigeria and many other places. And I think one of the easiest ways, kind of, to shoot down economic thinking or theory is to say it's IMF. You know, it's a very easy label. It's the easiest label to kind of use to shoot down anything. So I guess, you know, what's happening now further, it's certainly led to a lot of thinking around we need homegrown thinking. You know, so I think that one will notice that there's Africans are generally asking themselves, look, we've got to develop our own local solutions to local issues, and that is making us look, I think, towards Asia. So there's so a lot of people are sort of, I think we have a certain envy of sort of the way China, Japan have somewhat used local, you know, not is going with the West and just staying their own philosophies, their own thinking to solve their own problems. So yeah, there definitely is a shift, I think, for us from West sort of to East.
That's very interesting, and again, we'll come back to these. This is just opening up the discussion. Emily, Tolu mentioned Asia, and obviously this is your part of the world. You come from Hong Kong, and democracy is something that, as you said a little earlier, it's interesting, is that you can talk about democracy protests, but it's actually the democracy, as people in Hong Kong perhaps understand better the philosophical aspects of the discussion than most, simply because it's a living reality that Hong Kong has not been a democracy, and yet you have a lot of the trappings of democracy. I mean, perhaps talk a little bit about that, about what is the context, what is it that people aspire to, and in the real world, what do they believe they can achieve in the Hong Kong context?
Yes, thank you, Robin. I think I agree with Roderick, who said that populism is inspired by, you know, people who have been left behind, whether it's in America and elsewhere. And I think many of those people are very angry. I kept electing either this government or that government, and whoever takes power, I don't get any improvement. So why don't I go for someone brand new? I mean, Donald Trump or others. And what really scared me about populism, especially in Germany and Donald Trump and elsewhere, is their hostility against immigrants or other religious or ethnic minorities. So that makes them very hostile and very frightening. In Hong Kong, we are a very homogeneous society, although I always stress we must be multicultural, multiracial, very diverse, and we welcome people from all over the world. And we don't have this populism yet, although, of course, there's huge disparity between the rich and the poor. But what you are seeing on your TV and newspaper every day for 6 months, the protest was started by a piece of legislation which will enable the government to extradite people found guilty in the mainland but came back to Hong Kong. So the offense has to exist in both places, and to extradite to mainland China. And the government never expected the people to be so frightened. And Carrie Lam, the chief executive, admitted it. She completely underestimated the people's anxiety. So what sparked off that was not like in Chile or Lebanon or Bolivia or elsewhere. And but I think some of the problems that when we talk about populism, it exists in Hong Kong too. So, talking about Africa, wanting to learn from China, my dear friend, what is it that you want to learn? I thought we want democracy. Japan, well, it's quasi-democracy. The liberal Democrats have been running the country for so many decades. But in China, I mean, you are smiling, my dear friend. Do you really want to have very authoritarian rule?
Absolutely not.
So why do you want to learn from such a country? I don't understand. If you want to have homegrown solutions, and I can fully appreciate that, because you cannot just import things from the West, but you cannot just import something wholesale when there is authoritarianism, complete denial of not Western, but universal core values. Now in China, mainland China, you can't talk about those things. You go to Google, you can't find those words. And if you say that, you'll be locked up. I cannot go to mainland China for 30 years. And if I speak like that in the mainland, I'll disappear. I'll be locked up, and my families will not be able to visit me. My lawyers cannot visit me. I mean, I speak as a member of the board of directors of the China Human Rights Lawyers Concerned Group. And I know how horrible it is. So my dear friend, I think you have to think very carefully before you learn from China. I don't know why he said that.
No, I know why you said what you said. I think Tolu's point was, I think your point was simply that it's not to admire Chinese authoritarianism.
No,
it's simply
absolutely
to the point that people can do things, you can develop and not just be
I think
from Europe.
a big part of it also just has to do with a certain self-confidence, in local systems, local thinking, local, philosophies. I think it's that, for a continent that has seen, that saw slavery and then saw a long colonial rule. One of the biggest challenges is actually that mental, it's the mindset, where, there's that saying about how, the colonialists came and we had the land and they had the Bible, and then, they gave us the Bible and they took the land. There's some saying about, but there's that sense, it's more acute in places like South Africa. A lot more than, of course, with apartheid than in West Africa. But generally all over the continent, there's just that, there's that feeling that, look, we need to be more confident about who we are. And I think that's why, so it's not about the Chinese authoritarianism, absolutely not. People want freedom, as you said, universal values, but it's about self-confidence and, being able to, not having to sort of ape or imbibe everything that comes from outside. Yeah.
This question of confidence is something that I want to bring back to, first of all, to Roderick and then Janice, certainly. Oh, Janice, do you want to jump in and say something?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment that will probably annoy a lot of people in the room.
It's your speciality.
It is. So there is a huge element of left behind in these populist movements. When we map the attributes of people who voted for Trump, it's almost a perfect fit with people who vote for Brexit. And these are usually people, not necessarily who've lost their jobs, but have seen their local economies decline. And the most important attribute, actually, one, they're worried about their children's future, not their own, but they think their children will have a far less good future than they have. But here's the comment I want to make. They feel disrespected by liberal elites. We had a candidate in the last election who, probably in the remark that jumped out most at me, was she said 50% of the people who are voting for Donald Trump are deplorable. And it's that lack of respect, which is really fundamentally at variance with what democracy is, which is respect for everybody. That is, I think, the untold story. There is a very large responsibility here among liberal elites for the kind of conversation we've had. And it's on us in many ways. I think populism is interesting only insofar as it pushes everybody to think, well, what are the solutions? How do we move the agenda forward? And yes, there are economic policies, and yes, we have to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. These are all really important elements, but the part that we don't want to talk about, and I'll stop after this, but I was in a similar kind of panel where we were talking about this, and I said, we need to treat our fellow citizens with respect, even when we disagree with them. And one of the audience members got up and said, you expect me to treat with respect people who are xenophobic, racist, and hate women? That's function, and that's putting everybody in a box here and increasing the divide and making it very, very difficult for us to move forward into the next stage of this discussion.
Right. I mean, and Janice, we've talked about this, that this approach, which has almost become entrenched in the way that elites talk about the public, is that you put one foot wrong, you say one thing, and it may well be something that is worth condemning, and then your entire personality, the entire history of that person is written off. There was a case in the last, well, not the last election, the last but one election in Great Britain. I don't know whether it made it over to this side of the Atlantic, but Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister, and he went to a working class area of, I can't remember which town, but it was somewhere in the south of England, I think. And he went to some fairly sort of rundown area, and he went knocking on the door, and this woman just said, well, what are you going to do about all the immigrants? It wasn't completely clear what she meant. She might just have meant that, my community, there's just too much too fast or whatever. And when he got back in his car, he'd left the microphone on. And he said, and his advisor asked him, said, oh, so what was that? And he just said, oh, just some bigoted woman. And it was really, and you thought, my God, this woman is like, she may well be wrong in what she's saying. Her entire personality was just written off and just stamped on. And that, I think, is what you're talking about, Janice.
It is.
You keep doing this again and again, and don't be that surprised if people start voting for some pretty unpleasant characters. Speaking of unpleasant characters, not you, Roderick, but Alternative for Deutschland are fairly unpleasant. I think it's fair to say. We agree on that. But coming to Janice's point, I mean, it's very easy to point the finger and to lament, and which is what we're all doing. Everybody's lamenting the whole situation with populism. But, let's turn the tables a little bit. What is it that the elites have been doing wrong? One of them may be the conversation and the style of conversation. Is there a conversation in Germany right now which goes beyond simply saying Alternative for Deutschland are terrible and that's it? Is there anything self-reflective about how we might, as elites, do things better?
This would be too much at the surface. I would like to give an example. 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall was torn down, the Iron Curtain fell down, and we in Germany were very happy for unification. However, we forgot that 1/3 of the population, 17 million people, or 1/4 of the population, 17 million people, lost their purpose. They lost their employments, they lost their chances, but they gained freedom. But by gaining the freedom, we were not aware that we have to keep working places, that we have to keep opportunities for their life, that we need to invest in their infrastructure. So people lost their employment on the one side, but they gained freedom of movement, freedom of speech, new opportunities as well. But they lost the purpose of community. They lost a purpose given from the state. They were now responsible for themselves. And we underestimated that. We were not aware. I was a young company commander at that time in the so-called Build-Up East. We dismantled the former GDR People's Army, and we built up a new federal armed forces system. And by that, we were also advisors for public health, for public care, for insurance companies, and all the issues which they were not used to. I lived in a town with about 30,000 inhabitants. We were from West Germany, about 15, and we were also included into a lot of advisory boards. And at that time, I remarked, I founded my family there, my wife is from Eastern Germany. I remarked at the time, we lose their patience and we lose their willingness to follow the new system if we were not able to offer them opportunities for skilled work. And at that time, there was the foundation of the situation we have today. So the issue is not always what came up after 2015. It was the time between 1990 and 2014. And I will be brief, but it is important to understand this because it's also remarkable in Poland or in Hungary. From 1990 to 2014, more than 11 million people immigrated to Germany. From former Russia, 3 million, from the European Union, 4 million, and from countries like Africa or the Near Middle East, about 4 million via asylum, not via an immigration law. Germany has an immigration law since 4 years, and we will now have a better one by next month. So we waited too long, and we thought that people get used to this migration. 11 million means about 1/7 of the whole population. And we did not invest in education, in vocational training. It was done by itself, so it was not steered, it was not coordinated, it worked. But it peaked in 2015 when another 1.5 million came in and the people were upset. And who became upset? Those who were the losers of unification and those who came in between 1990 and 2014 who were at the end of the society from former Russia, for example. We tried to integrate them, but they were in fear that the social benefits they had to be divided with the others, with the newcomers. So now we have a budget in Germany. More than half of our federal budget is for social welfare, 52%. And that's a lot by our budget, which is about 380 billion euros. More than 190 billion euros is for social integration and social welfare. So we try to buy integration, but we need to invest in the mindset of the people. And this we may talk later on, but we need to invest in the mindset of the people as well, not only in social welfare.
Emily, coming back again, I mean, there's a sense in which because this is not, thankfully, just a discussion about North America and Europe, that there are different parts of the puzzle, the democracy puzzle, to put together. So there's a sense in which it would be very easy to make this extremely coherent by making it very narrow, but we don't want to do that. And I think that what we're trying to do here is to pull apart some of the key elements that make democracies work, the key elements that can help build democracies, and also try and work out, well, where are we heading in the next 5 to 10 years, whether it be in Germany, whether it be in Canada, the United States, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in Nigeria, whether it be in Hong Kong. Right now in Hong Kong, and coming back specifically to what's going on in Hong Kong at the moment, Hong Kong, what actually is the aim of the protesters? I know you can't speak for every single protester, but what, by and large, do people want?
Well, of course, I can't speak for them because they say the big thing about this protest is there's no leader, no platform, nobody can speak for them. Everyone speaks for themselves. But of course, it's not shared by everybody. And I think many Hong Kong people, of course, they want democracy. I speak as someone who's fought for it for a number of decades. But as you rightly said, Robin, we enjoy many of the trappings of democracy, like freedom, personal safety, rule of law, independence of the judiciary. We enjoy these things, in fact, much more than many countries with periodic elections in Asia and elsewhere. So people come to Hong Kong, they say, wow, so free, so safe, and so on. But now, because of the extradition bill protests, everything is at stake. And people get more and more worried because of the police brutality and also the Chinese government's very tough stance. People are getting very worried that whatever we've had in the last 20, 30 years are going to disappear. And of course, under one country, two systems, that is China's agreement with the British government in 1997, we have one country, two systems, meaning Here in Hong Kong, we can have capitalism, free lifestyle, whereas the mainland, they don't. And we can only have that for 50 years. That is 2047. And that is 20 odd years away. It's not that far. But I don't think I'll be around to see it. And that's what sometimes journalists ask me, Ms. Lau, 2047, 20 odd more years, what's going to happen? I said, there's a saying, in the long term, we're all dead.
That was John Maynard Keynes, who's a British economist, who said that.
Why don't you die now? Oh, say, Ms. Lau, of course we don't mean that. So we're going to fight. We're going to fight from now to 2047 and beyond. And what is it that we want, Robin? Of course we want democracy. We've been fighting for it for many years. But we also want to preserve our free lifestyle. And that's something that the Chinese government has promised, not just to us and to the United Kingdom government, but to the international community. Because the Sino-British Joint Declaration that was signed by Maggie Thatcher and Zhao Ziyang in December of 1984 was lodged with the United Nations. So what the people want now is beyond that bill, because the bill has finally been withdrawn, but because of the police brutality and the government's intransigence, the people want to reform the system. They want to reform the police force, of course, and we want to have an independent commission of inquiry to look into the whole saga. So what we want is to preserve our free lifestyle and preserve the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, and then to carry on with the reforms. But then they see the way that the Chinese government is reacting. They know it is going to be a very difficult thing to achieve. But still, and some young people, they feel that if they look ahead, there's no future. So they say, I've got nothing to lose. So they write out their will and put in their pocket and went to protest. So it's very, very sad. And they don't trust the government. They definitely do not trust the police.
Emily, just a question, perversely, because as
Why
you
do
say...
you want to be so perverse?
The Chinese authorities, as you say, China is beholden, not that governments, we all know governments can sign things and not live up to them, but the Chinese government has so far desisted. And is there a feeling, is this what's driving the momentum of the protesters, that they think, well, hold on a second, we can really push for everything here, because for a real democracy in Hong Kong, because the Chinese, there's too much at stake if they go in, if they do a Tiananmen Square, if they send in the army, and they're not going to do it. So is this what's driving them? Is part of what's driving the protesters the belief that, we can really push this now?
No, I don't think you're being fair, Robin. But next thing you're going to say
I'm not saying it's negative or wrong. I'm just saying, is that the thing from the
perverse.
protesters? No.
So next thing you're going to say is, they're going to push for independence. No. There are some who ask for independence, but they are in a minority. Because I think the vast majority of the Hong Kong people know that independence is the real red line. It's not on. Even Taiwan. They say if Taiwan dare to declare, which I think they have said so more or less, they will wage war with Taiwan. So I don't think most Hong Kong people would support independence. And I don't think you're right to say that, they think, China won't do it, so we go all the way. No, they think China is tough, and they've seen China cracking down on Chinese people, not just in Beijing in 1989. If you look at Xinjiang now, more than 1 million, I don't know how many, some say 2 million Uyghurs are being locked up. And the world doesn't seem to be doing very much. Even Muslim countries are not speaking out for them. You can count the number of Muslim countries in the world. So no, they're not. They know China is tough, but they are very happy when they see the international community, whether it is Canada or America or European Union. And we're very happy when Angela Merkel was in China a few months ago, and she spoke out twice on Hong Kong. And China cares, because every time when Hong Kong's raised on the international scene, China cares about face. So these people know, and that's why when the Human Rights and Democracy Act was passed in Congress, and then immediately there were many people going to the shopping centers to protest again. But I think they are pragmatic. So they say, I've got nothing to lose. So you come. But of course, we don't want that. As I said many times in the international media, we don't want to see rivers of blood flowing in Hong Kong. And there are many, many international people, foreign people living in Hong Kong, Canada. 300,000 Canadian citizens. UK, I don't know, maybe a bit less. Germans, a bit less. Americans, many companies there, foreign companies. So they have a stake, Robin. It's not just for the love of Hong Kong people. I don't think they want to have to mount evacuation schemes. So we want the world to watch and to be our friends and to tell China to exercise restraint. So in Canada, there have been quite a number of protests and all kinds of, events, which we are happy. And don't be frightened when China scolds you, because China loves to do that. And that's it. And we are, this is the David and Goliath, which some people find quite captivating when you see this tiny David refuse to just lie down and play dead. And that's the Hong Kong people, Robin. But they understand the reality. Thank you.
Tolu, in Nigeria, just give us a sense. I'm not sure, maybe I'm the only one that doesn't know the ins and outs of Nigerian democracy. Can you just give us encapsulate for us what is how secure, you said it's 20 years, a track record of 20 years now.
Well, 20 years, 20 years of unbroken democracy, so since 1999, which is the longest stretch. We had 6 years just after independence, a parliamentary system, because we got our independence from the UK, so it was natural to, that ended after only 6 years. For the next 13 years, it was military rule, and then we did 4 years of a presidential system, lasted only 4 years, another coup, and then another 16 years of military rule until 99. So it's been sort of, that back and forth. And it's only probably in the last decade that we've become quite confident that, okay, finally, this journey is here to stay. And it's almost unthinkable now to imagine that, we will go back to a dictatorship. So in that sense, it's all very new. So as I like to say it, we've gone, the evolution for us has been, many years when there was only one party, which was the military. And then, even when democracy started in 99, well, the latest stretch of it, for the longest time, actually, there was one main party and lots of small parties that could not challenge the main party. So even that, in one sense, is not your conventional democracy. And it was not until 2015, 16 years into this experiment, that for the first time, the opposition party defeated an incumbent. And so, in the last 4 years, we've had sort of two evenly matched parties. And that's a turning point. You go from one party that's a monopoly of sorts to two parties that can. And, it was fascinating to see what happened at the point when the opposition party in 2015, which is now the ruling party, defeated the incumbent. It was mind-opening. Nobody expected that would happen. And so in 2019, we had elections this year. And so in 2019, a lot of people, the idea of opposition defeating an incumbent had suddenly become a part of the mental landscape. So that evolution has been quite interesting to see how things have evolved. But as I said earlier, the next phase now is for those two evenly matched parties to then, I guess, develop some kind of ideology, distinct ideology. at the moment, you could almost argue that, they are two sides.
Personality driven?
Yeah, they're personality driven.
Yeah.
And so defections are extremely common. And sometimes the movements are quite large, and people can, half a dozen major politicians move from one party to another. And that's so for us now, I think, or the way I see the next phase of the journey is to then start to coalesce around issues. In these elections in 2019, in February, for the first time, we had some kind of semblance of ideology. So one of the parties was sort of the business, pro-business. We need to roll back government. We're the party of business and the elite. And another party, well, the other party was sort of were for the people. The elites have had their way for too long, but not in the sense of sort of the not in that pejorative sense of sort of populism, but we
like a Labour Party versus a
like a Labour Party type of we need to get we're the party of welfare, a social investment program. The masses of Nigeria need to have a voice and a say. So we're starting to see that, and it's interesting to watch. But we're still a long way, I think, from the kind of conversations that go on in the West, where you have a long history of those ideological divides.
But you seem, and last year when we were on the panel with me last year, you seem optimistic. You seem that, look, this is all to play for.
Yeah, I think I'm fundamentally optimistic. I'm fundamentally optimistic.
Good to hear.
Because, we were having this conversation earlier today, and Janice did make the point that, if you are caught up in the moment and all you see is the now, and all of the history that you have is the last few years into the next few years, it's very easy to be pessimistic. But if you have a much longer term view, of I forget who it was who talked about the arc of justice.
Martin Luther King.
Yeah, it's the long-term view absolutely helps. To be honest, there's in the very short term, there's not a lot that is going to happen in places like Africa that will completely change the story in the very short term. But in the much longer term, you can start to see, even from the point of view of things like polio, disease. You can start to see, even in terms of sort of education, the indices. When you take a long-term view, you start to see some, you start to see progress. You start to see some coalescing of positive indices. But in the very short term, things look quite bleak. And I know that, like Germany, for example, Italy, much of Europe is concerned about a flood of migrants from Nigeria and from other parts of Africa, which is a big issue. But when you take the long-term view, when you look at investments going into power, into infrastructure and all that, fundamentally I think that we're going to get to a point where people are going to see a lot more hope, sort of in staying back at home and building and all that. But it has to be a long-term view. It's not... if you keep your eye in the moment, you can be. It's quite depressing. But if you look,
I can't help but say, listening to Emily and Tolu, it's the same argument. When people feel they have nothing to lose, that's when democracy breaks down. If there's any kind of optimism, and I'm an optimist, let me say, I join with Tula at this moment, I'm optimistic. The very definition of democracy, it's safe to lose, right? You're going to lose an election, you're going to live through it. Nobody's going to come and decapitate you, and you're going to fight another day in the next electoral campaign. So that's really one of the most important hallmarks of democracy, is that it's safe to lose. That's not true. In Emily's case right now, it's not safe. There's been a history in your country where it's not safe. So giving people a sense that even in our developed democracies. You know, in Canada, in the province that I come from, Ontario, we have a populist premier now. And the people who voted for him were pessimistic, felt that they had very little to lose, and that's why they voted for him. So I think the agenda forward is making sure that people feel that they have a stake in the future, that it's fairer, that it's more equal, and that they have something to lose if they disrupt the system.
Well, I confess, Janice, I was just going to ask,
Okay.
how is it that Canada's an exception? And
It isn't.
To have populism? You're pointing out it isn't an
It
exception.
isn't. It isn't. We Canadians are so nice, we don't always tell ourselves what we know, because we're polite with ourselves, in addition to being polite with everybody else. I come from a city in this country that elected a populist mayor.
Right.
Right? And that's our biggest city. My province now has a populist premier. And again, when we look at the constituencies in the districts who voted, it's a very similar pattern to what you're talking about. People who feel left behind, right? People who are not hopeful about the future. People who feel they don't have that much to lose. People who feel that the system has not been fair to them, that they're not respected, that there are these, you know, the language I always use, there are these latte-sipping downtown elites who don't understand me at all and have no time for me. It's all of that built into it. And where does the hostility to immigration come from? It's actually not so much hostility to immigrants, but it's the sense of, I'm not moving forward, and that's where you start, and somebody else is going to come and do better than I am in my country. That's where this comes.
That's a very interesting point, and I'll just add a dimension, slightly abusing the role of moderator here, but from the UK, is that in the period from where the European Union's big expansion was in 2004, and Britain was one of the few countries that immediately said, we're just opening our borders.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is I never got the sense that really anybody had any problem with the Polish and Czech and Slovak and immigrants at all. So it wasn't so much anti-immigration. What they were furious about is that this had been done without their consent.
Yeah.
And it is true that when it came to certain, those who know the UK may know a town called Peterborough, just up from London, well, about 100 miles from London, really, 50 miles or so. About a third of the city essentially became Polish in a very short space of time. And it's not that anybody really has a problem with the Poles, just that, hold on a second, it's like such a short space of time, my entire locale has changed. And I think it really was this sense, again, it was the elites, and this is where populism has resonated, where people actually don't really have a problem with the immigrants. What they have a problem with is the elites who just said, you're going to accept this whether you like it or not.
And you're a really backward-looking person because you don't understand it.
Right. What's interesting about, I'm going to allow people to come in and ask questions now. What I think is interesting, so those who are walking around with microphones, be prepared. Everybody here is coming from a slightly different perspective. You could argue that that Roderick and I well, I'm not from Europe anymore because we're Brexiting, but
will never happen, the Brexit.
From North America, but actually people are coming at it from different stages. Germany is obviously a very robust democracy, a very successful economy, a pivotal player in Europe. And yet it, of course, has a very particular history, which Roderick referred to in the context of the Alternative for Deutschland. My own country has a very particular history, which makes it very different. One of the reasons for Brexit, in fact, is a very different history regarding the Second World War. And also, Britain has not been invaded successfully since 1066. It's the Norman Conquest. It creates an entirely different approach to politics and ultimately also to democracy. And Tolu has talked about Nigeria and a relatively short period of democracy, but something where it looks very much, and again, it's very much, you're coming across exactly the same way as last year, very optimistic, not at all naive about the challenges, but really look a little bit ahead, not just what's right in front of you. And then again, Emily coming from a very different context where you have this well, she put it herself, this Goliath, this enormous great monolith, which you simply can't take on if it comes to a battle of force. And yet if it comes to a battle of wills, and a certain settlement, that the Hong Kongers are showing that they're going to protect their rights, and it's an incredible sight to behold. Okay, everybody is welcome to make a.
I think somebody's got the mic already.
Yes, I can see it. Yes, so please go ahead. What I would say is that you're quite welcome to make a comment and put it to the panelists. But whether it's a comment or a question, please don't make it longer than 30 seconds.
It's okay. Yeah. Good evening. 你好，兄姐. I'm from Hong Kong. Well, I'm a graduate student here in the IDS department. And as someone from Hong Kong, it's great for me to stay safe here because otherwise my mom has told me that I otherwise will be on the street, will be on the front line. I'm upset though. I believe in one country, two system. I believe in our autonomy, but and I don't see many of us are supporting independent movement. But at this moment, Beijing is accusing us as a separatist. They shut down all the dialogue, any discussion with us. But it is not our intention. It is not our people's intention. We just want our representative government. And your party, your Democratic Party, have done this conversation, dialogue with the Hong Kong government, with Beijing, like long before this movement began. So do you think it's the mistake that your party or the existing political elite fail us, so we young people have to go on the street now? Or do you think it's the Beijing responsibility that not letting us to have the freedom? Or how much do you think your responsibility is? Thank you.
Emily, please go right ahead.
Well, of course, we have not succeeded in getting democracy for Hong Kong. That's very obvious. But then to turn around and say we have not achieved much and failed the people, that's something I would never accept. And it's not just the Democratic Party. We're quite small. But it's all the people of Hong Kong who have fought for decades. Of course, they fought for democracy. They could not succeed. But they have fought to preserve the free lifestyle, the rule of law, the personal safety. If we had not been for all those efforts in these few decades, we would have been like Macau or like Guangzhou within days, my dear friend. So I think, don't take that away from the people who have fought for so long. And my party, actually we did not negotiate with the Chinese. A few years ago, they proposed a package, not for democracy, and it was not good enough, and we proposed to amend it. So there were 10 more seats in the legislature. So the Chinese at first opposed. They later changed their mind, which is quite extraordinary, and I hope Xi Jinping would change his mind soon. They changed their mind and accepted my party's proposal. If you don't like it, I fully respect your view, just like our friends are saying, we have to have respect. You know what Donald Trump said? People say they are white trash. He said, they are like me, people like me, except I'm richer. So there's no respect. I respect your view, but I think it is unfair to say that for decades we have not done anything, we have let the people down. As I said, Hong Kong people for decades have enjoyed freedom, personal safety, and the rule of law much, much more than many countries which have periodic elections where their people can be shot at, can be abducted, can disappear. And that is not something that has fallen from the sky like manna. It's the effort of people for decades. So my dear friend, now people are fighting in the streets, some people get injured. It's very sad, and we don't support it. but we do not support violence. My party does not, but we are very angry with the police brutality, and we will continue to fight. I've taken part in civil disobedience. I've been arrested a number of times, but if they charge me, take me to court for illegal assembly, I will plead guilty. I will go to jail. I will use my freedom to challenge you. That's the way we choose to behave. Others want to do it differently, that's fine. But we all have to take responsibility for our actions and our statements. So my dear friends, you can see there are different views, and this is what the Hong Kong that we want to be. Very diverse. People can argue, but I hope people will not attack each other viciously. And I heard that it's happening in Canada, in other countries too, on their campuses, because some of the students are very violent. That's why before this evening, I told Robin, I said, be careful. I mean, I'm going on to Toronto. We've notified the police, because some of the people can be exceedingly nasty, and I don't believe in that. But so thank you for giving me the opportunity to have my say, and we can have a longer discussion after the thing, so we hope you understand where we came from. And we will continue to fight. Although I have left LegCo, but I will never step down from the fight for democracy and human rights and the rule of law. And that's why when the forum invited me in August, I said, okay, I'll come. What? I will come to tell you the Hong Kong story. And I thank the forum, I thank the university for giving me the opportunity. And that's my take. And we all understand maybe younger people have their aspirations. But if we can all work together, we will be stronger. As you have heard, if we are divided, we are split up, we will be weaker. And when we face the Goliaths, and they would love to see us splitting up.
I of course don't want to split up like the forces. We are together in this moment. But just like, I'm not saying the mistake made in the past can be correct right now, but like we should just join force together, maybe in the future, maybe.
I think you're probably closer than you might
Yeah,
think.
sure,
Yes.
sure. Just that I don't accept that was a mistake made in the
Right.
past.
Yeah.
And I was telling you why, that we continue to enjoy so many things that other people do not enjoy from democratic countries. So it's not as if we all came back empty-handed. But as Robin said, we're getting closer. Thank you for bringing us together, Robin.
Well, thank you. And
That's the whole idea of having a discussion.
I think if anything goes wrong, I feel very safe sitting next to you. You're going to protect me. Okay, next question.
There's one there.
Yes, this gentleman here in the front row.
No, over there.
Sorry.
He's got the mic.
There's somebody with the mic.
Oh, sorry, yes, I've
please
got
stand up.
lights in my eyes, so yes.
Hello.
And also, if you don't mind, whoever you are, just state your name and your affiliation, or if you're a student, you don't have to just say you're a student here.
Great, thank you. First of all, my thanks to all the panelists for their very interesting comments in this great discussion. My name is Kiran Banerjee. I'm in the Department of Political Science here at Dalhousie. I do have one quick intervention and then one question related to that. It concerns the use of the term populism in this discussion, and I wonder whether we need to think about the language we use when we talk about this sort of phenomena, because I often find myself wondering whether this is a misnomer, whether what we're talking about is actually, especially in the context of the United States or Europe, are anti-consensus parties rather than populist parties. And my reason for thinking that is that when we look at the example, say, of Germany with the AfD, it's not a majority party. To speak of it as popular or representing the people, I think is a bit misleading and politically costly. If we speak of the Populist Party in the federal Canadian election, the People's Party, I mean, this was a party which, the leader of which wasn't able to retain his seat. To talk about it as popular seems odd, and I think we mistake the relationship between, when we use the word popular, we're invoking the idea of the people, but also democracy. The roots of those two words are the same, and I think we give up a lot of ground when we suggest that these are the same, when we're talking about these far-right parties.
I understand exactly where you're coming from, but I think nobody is using the word populist to mean popular. That's not an equivalence that anybody makes. The word populist is used because parties of the kind that we are talking about speak in the name of the people. That's where they come from. So even Emily's example right now, I thought was a great one, where she said Donald Trump said, everybody calls us white trash, right? But we, the people, and I'm the man of the people. So it's in that sense that they're populist, but that doesn't mean at all that they're popular.
Yeah, I understand, but I think when we accept their label as populist, we take on the assumption that, or we sort of accept the premise of the
I frankly think it doesn't
position.
matter much what we call them. I think what's really important is for us to understand why they have the appeal that they do, and what the response moving forward should be. And again, just to pick up in a sense on Tulu's earlier comment, because we were having this discussion earlier today, this is not the first time that there has been a populist upsurge or a populist wave. Actually, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, in their book on global financial crises, which is called This Time is Different, argued, in fact, it's not. And after every global financial crisis, virtually without exception, 10 years later, it ends with a tale of populism. So we can learn a lot by looking seriously at the past. What strategies did governments use in democracies, in fact, to suck the oxygen out of these kinds of movements? That's, I think, what we should be talking about.
Yeah, and actually, my question comes up exactly on the point you just made, which is, if we take a more structural look at the rise of these sorts of movements, it seems to be very much related to economic transformations and larger structural factors. So, and this is a question to the whole panel rather. I was wondering what the relationship between globalization and larger economic transformations, particularly financialization of economic markets, has toward the new sort of populism we're seeing in the world right now.
Okay, Tolu, do you want to start? Thank you.
One of the things that I think has been an underlying theme, of course, is marginalization, a sense of, and it doesn't matter where it is, whether it's Canada or Germany or Nigeria, that sense of marginalized people. So just this evening, somebody tagged me on a video. Someone from Nigeria tagged me on a video of a former Canadian Prime Minister, not sure who, asked a question about the west of Canada feeling marginalized. So it was a video from recently.
Yes, it would be recent. It would be after the recent election.
Yes, after, and there was something, there was a question, a journalist put a question to the former Prime Minister and said something about, what's the government doing to sort of cater to the marginalized feelings of the west of Canada. And he said something about how, well, there's one person in cabinet who's, so I'm not very familiar with Canadian politics, but the point is, someone from Nigeria tagged me on that and said, made a comment about, how Canada is just like Nigeria. We have, there's a whole industry of marginalization, So in Nigeria, we had a civil war in 67 to 70. It's been 50 years, but the sense of marginalization that came out of that war from southeastern Nigeria, so Biafra, I don't know how many people are familiar with Biafra. It was a big issue in the US, and much of Europe, but that marginalization has not gone anywhere. And so there's often a sense that, and so in the actually for much of the last 20 years, there have been multiple attempts to separatist movements, to which evoke what's happening even like in the UK, and all that. So, but I think it almost doesn't matter where. There's so much similarity in terms of the feeling of marginalization, regardless of how prosperous the society is. So whether it's Nigeria with a per capita income of under $5,000, or Canada or Germany, or it's that sense that we're left behind, or sometimes it's historical grievances, sometimes it's income inequalities, whatever it is, but that sense. And the internet, I think, has done a very good job of amplifying and deepening and connecting marginalized peoples. So the Biafrans in Nigeria, and the, Catalonia in Spain, and, it's everybody feels like one community. Before the internet, there were those isolated pockets. And isolated pockets, it's difficult, I mean, there's a lot of energy and safety in numbers. But when you can, on the internet, see how the Catalonians in Spain are struggling to, if you're in Nigeria and you have that same feeling, it's, there's a solidarity, so I think that we haven't talked much about the part that the internet has played in connecting marginalized peoples and making it feel like, look, we're not alone, and we have this giant movement, and we will succeed some way or the other.
I just want to make one quick comment about that last question, which I thought was really great, because globalization is a big part of it's a big part of this story, and we don't talk about it enough, so I agree completely with you. And here's the irony, right, that I call the period from 1990 to 2007 globalization on steroids, hyper-globalization. There have been an earlier period like that in European history. But during that period where global trade expanded as a proportion of the global economy, in the early period, 1 million manufacturing jobs left North America and went to the People's Republic of China. And so many of these districts who are Trump voters are areas where manufacturing jobs left North America. Now think about this globally, it's a great story because between India and China, we have almost 1 billion people who've been lifted out of poverty during this period, but that doesn't help in a small town in Ohio or Pennsylvania, where in fact, those gaps have grown during that period. So there is a really important agenda here, and there's really interesting work being done now about how states have to assume their sovereign obligation, is the best way I can put it, to actually look at the discrepancies within their own societies. And pay attention, because that is, I don't think it's the only factor, but I think you're right, that this is a driving force of a lot of what we've seen. Now, is that going to be good for the world? Not in the same way that it was during the period that you talked about, but we're balancing but we're going to have very ugly politics if we ignore the local at the expense of the global. Is all I could say.
There's another dimension to this, which I'll just introduce, because Janice is very kindly looking over a book that I'm writing on democracy in the digital revolution. And and this goes to very much to the question you asked about trusted institutions and where this has all come from. Now, populist parties might be quite new, in a certain sense. I mean, yes, you can go back decades and it's periodically come up. Distrust in our institutions, which is the sort of bedrock that they're feeding on, has been going on for decades. And if you look at the opinion poll evidence and use the United States Congress, which is a brilliant proxy because it's sort of the great shining light on the hill, and it's the greatest democracy in the world and all the rest of it, the United States population, the distrust in the Congress is phenomenal, and it's been going for decades. So anybody who thinks that this has just happened in the last 10 years is living in cloud cuckoo land. It might be that Donald Trump just arose, but the distrust which underlies it has been going on, and it goes way back. You go back to the 1980s, the 1970s. This is nothing new at all. So I'm just going to introduce that as a dimension, since you raised one of the issues that's usually described. Maybe it's globalization, maybe it's stagnant wages. It can't actually be any of those things because they're relatively recent. This has been going on for a long time. Okay, another question? I can't see, the lights are right in my eyes, so.
I know, all of us.
Okay, yes, please, the lady, I can't quite even see who it is there, but.
Hello. Hi. Oh, hi. Hi, my name is Walter. I'm a student of architecture in Dalhousie. So I have this question about populism. I think populism obviously actually works for disenfranchised people as a powerful political tool to unite the people to change the incumbent system. And it obviously has the drawback of anti-intellectualism and short-termism, largely because of disinformation. So I ask this panel, how can we use the power of populism while playing down the drawbacks of disinformation?
Do you essentially mean that, which is something I raised right at the beginning, that, the critique of the elites is not illegitimate? But
Yeah,
so we want
exactly.
to-
Like in the case of Hong Kong, and I'm from Hong Kong too.
Right, so how do we sort of channel the energy which is directed towards injustices and iniquities in our societies, but not scapegoat immigrants, for example, or that kind of thing?
Yeah,
In
the
other words, take the best and
hostility.
discard the...
Yeah.
Yeah, but perhaps Roderick might want
It's
to...
a very interesting question you just have raised, Walter. I think the ruling systems, the ruling parties, or those being in responsibility, need to improve the sense of transparency. And they should better explain their decisions. And we need transparent decision-making processes. Because one part, the dark side of populism, is to question all information by a government or by a parliament being fake news or being wrong or being biased. And therefore, it's not only to see populists as a scapegoat and the others are the free and good people. It is also a question of transparency, of the willingness to share information and to encourage people to participate. So it's also a question of the possibility to participate inside the society, not only on the municipal level, also on the district level and higher levels. And therefore, I see also that populism is combined with the fear of disruption, with the fear of not keeping pace with the velocity, with speed of change. And there is no recipe because you have to dovetail it or to tailor it to the different areas and to the different situations. But I think it's also the responsibility of those under criticism. That means that the ruling systems, being either democratic or being authoritarian, they need to gain the hearts and minds of the people and not to defend their own acquis. And therefore, the so-called closed shops of the elites is a wrong way. And therefore, I plea, and we are trying to, it's very difficult, also in Germany, it's not easy, but we try to keep transparent processes. And then on the reverse side, you can ask them, well, we have opened you transparency, we have opened you opportunities to participate and also to share your views, but you are obstructive. You do not want to participate. You try to change the system. You see the system to be changed by default, but you are not willing to participate and to be constructive. So I see it's a balanced way to overcome populism. But to be very honest, this is very theoretical. I believe that we are at the eve of an escalation. We will perceive much more populism in the world because it's not from the people who are populists. It's also from those from outside, from other countries, from other governments, hybrid warfare and something like that, who try to change societies in their sense to be influential and then also to weaken competitive systems, to exploit them for their own sake. I do not want to talk about Ossetia and Georgia. I do not want to talk about Crimea and Ukraine or Estonia and other countries being sacrifices of those approaches. But I ask all of us to be much more aware, on the one side to fight for transparency, but on the other side also to target to those who exploit the system and are not willing to be constructive.
So you kind of provide a prescription for the political elite, but how about the people? What can the people do especially in the case of Hong Kong?
Very brief. The elites must be open for change. Yeah. and the elite is not a given. So they should be transparent, and they should be open also to enhance elites. And what is an elite? Is it an elite of money, or is it an elite of knowledge and endeavor and of compassion? And we cannot afford in this world of globalization that we have elites being built of heritage and money laundering. We need elites of thoughtfulness. And this is a question to mindful students like you, to align yourself, to build coalitions of those who have the same mindset, and you have to bear a lot. You have to go through valleys of tears, but you fight for enlightenment and fight for the spirit of democracy, and there you must be proud of it, and you deserve all the support also from Europe. And I'm a partisan of those. We need not to do every business with China for the disadvantage of freedom and of Hong Kong. We have to be very selective in our business with China. I do not want to talk about Huawei and 5G, but I also talk about, really, do we need every new business model to be established in China for another revenue to Germany? I'm very skeptical about that.
Let me add a rider to that, and it seems, and Tolu actually touched upon it, and it seems the next stage in this discussion has to be, do we revamp our political institutions fundamentally to realign with the digital revolution? The United States is very easy to deal with in a certain sense because it started at a very clear point in time and there's a constitution and all the rest of it. But just using that as a proxy for Western democracy, our democratic representative systems were created in the 18th century, for goodness sake. And they haven't really changed. Okay, lots of things have changed around them, but by and large, that's what you've got. And the backdrop, of course, technologically, socially, culturally, was very different. Is that sustainable? Is it sustainable to continue with an 18th century model of democracy in the 21st century? That's the subject of my book, by the way. And the answer, just not to have any cliffhangers, is no. Okay? But I'm going to start. Let's start with Tolu, since you are the digital advisor to the president of Nigeria, and it's a relatively young democracy.
Clearly, I'm not sure that anybody envisaged that the internet would be so disruptive so quickly. So last week, 2 weeks ago, I was in Paris for the Paris Peace Forum, and one question that kept coming up was sort of about, of course, disinformation and digital disinformation and all. And I remember somebody saying something about how just a decade ago the internet was seen as this amazing tool for freedom, for openness, for empowering democracies, for connecting people, and all that. And it's barely 10 years later. Most of the conversation where the internet comes up now is about division, is about undermining democracy and all that. I'm not sure that we bargained for this. So there's a lot of catching up to do, obviously. Even before you get to sort of, so you talked about the political structures that need to catch up, but even more urgent, I think, is the fact that we need to come to terms with what the beast that we've unleashed with the internet and the potential for sort of, people who want to undermine democracies and people who see the potential of populism, the power that they have, the potential that the internet offers them to advance their ambitions and their goals. We need to come to terms with that. And that for me is actually a more urgent assignment that, we've got to deal with that before we then think of sort of the longer term, how do we adapt our political structures and all that, to this age. We've got to deal with, that aspect of disinformation, and it's actually a big deal because you also cannot speak of populism without speaking of distorting facts. There's a lot of distortions. It's never when you play to the sensibilities of marginalized people, it's not a fact-based conversation. It's emotional and so whether it's in the UK where there's the whole talk of, oh look, when we leave the EU, we're going to get £350 million or something a week, that whether it's that or it's in anywhere in the world, there's that distortion of facts. I think we've got to figure out how are we going to deal with that, because for me it's probably the biggest enabler of populism as we see it, and the most urgent assignment for us to handle.
Thanks. Again, I've got the lights right in my eyes, so I can barely see. Yes, the gentleman here has been waiting for a while.
Andre Bernard, a faculty member with the Faculty of Medicine. Captivating panel discussion thus far. I want to just go back to where we began, and it links to, I think, what Walter had said before, and this idea of populism defined as an emergent phenomenon of vulnerability, of that head-down metaphor of people feeling maybe hopeless and seeing that emerge out of those preconditions. But I was captivated by the title of the talk, which was Populism Peaked, and I put a question mark there, because the other aspect of populism is populism as instrument of power. And I think about our nation to the south that has propped up, or someone who has moved into that presidency, that has, to me, and I'm an elite, I'll admit that, has nothing in common with the vulnerable people with whom he wishes to identify. Yeah. And yet, through the misinformation, populism is being asserted into society and manifest. And some of you will have seen The Great Hack in the Netflix documentary that shows how misinformation can cultivate conditions. I'd like to hear your response to, is populism peaking? Or are we, as people from government, places of government, are there responses that enable us to actually push that aside? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Janet, it sort of speaks very much to what you were saying.
There's probably real division on this panel. I think Roderick and I think that it has not peaked. And I actually want to tie the earlier question to why I think we have a challenging short-term future ahead of us. Because Robin raised the issue of the internet and digital media, but that is the tip of the iceberg. We are fairly well into the first phase of the fourth industrial revolution. So it's not only digital media, it's a digital universe in which the nature of work as we know it will change. There will be, I think, radically uneven consequences for people. Those who are digital literates will do much better than those who are not. And again, when we look back, which I do to learn, when we look back at the earlier industrial revolutions, they were just enormously disruptive. The first one started in Britain, and one of the ways I talk about this all the time is to say those beautiful John Turner paintings that we all love, he was just painting industrial pollution of the worst kind in London, and people would come in to become workers in the factories, lived in hovels, and were subjected to terrible epidemics. And it took the British government 70 or 80 years to put in place the most minimal kinds of programs to begin to address some of those inequalities. Now, layer on to the populist wave that we have now, a much larger disruption. If we think globalization costs 1 million manufacturing jobs, it's nothing compared to what's coming as our whole economy and society reorders itself in an age of artificial intelligence and a digital economy and a digital society. So I think the kinds of political movements that we're seeing have not peaked for that reason, because the disruption that we've seen, we're on the early stages of the wave. Now, the institutions, to come to your question, Robin, I think institutions should lag. That's why we have them. They're not the leading edge. They shouldn't be the leading edge. They're like insurance policies. They're the umbrellas that we put up in the storm. And when things are really rough, those institutions are there. And their job is to bridge differences. So I'm really glad. I think some of our politicians who are on Twitters, I wish they'd stop. I really wish they'd stop and do their job, which is to reach out and bridge differences in our society and think about the people who are being disadvantaged and spend a lot less time with their thumbs and more time with their heads. It would be much better.
I think I agree with Janice that the outlook is quite bleak.
Not bleak.
If you look at Asia and elsewhere,
Not bleak.
there are many countries which are supposed to be democratic and they are declining. So I don't understand why my African friend is so optimistic. And you look at Hong Kong, you have certain things so for several decades.
It's a good story.
And it can suddenly
Africa is a really good story, though.
before your very eyes. So that is the lesson. Something that you can take for granted or something there, and suddenly it can disappear very fast. So I think that it's very pessimistic. But then there's another saying: the people get the government they deserve. Who said it?
I think a lot of people have said that.
So I think it's up to, the student over there, what should people do? We can give you some answers, but you all have to think. You have to rise up. Maybe you become populists because you are so frustrated, so angry with the governing elites. And some of them are very lazy, they are very hypocritical, duplicitous, and corrupt. So, I think people have to do something. And you say, reform the political system. Well, we have to, but you need them to agree, isn't it? You need the corrupt, duplicitous elites to change it, unless there's a people's revolution, peaceful.
Well, that's always fun. One of the interesting things, and Janice touched upon it, is that we're very much in a transitional environment, and I'm certainly in relation to the book I'm writing. One of the things that the digital revolution is often compared to, because we're always looking for something to give us a roadmap or a compass, is of course the invention of movable type. And the Gutenberg revolution which occurred in 1440, and the person who is the seminal book on this is by an academic, she's deceased now, called Elizabeth Eisenstein. She wrote a book called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. And one of the most fascinating things is, and I think it speaks to what Janice is saying, but also to the kind of difficulty we face at the moment, is that in this incredible transitional environment, when she was looking at what people had said and written before the invention of movable type, there's tons and tons of stuff, okay? And there's tons of stuff about what it was like after the invention of movable type, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution. But there's very, very little about what it was like at the time, because people almost literally didn't know what to think. And those of you who follow the writings of Clay Shirky, he talks about this a lot. If you look at the Reformation and the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, well, is this the work of God and the most wonderful thing ever, or is it the work of the devil? People didn't know at the time. And I think that one of the problems that we're facing is this transitional environment where we're in it and we don't really know we're in it. And it's incredibly difficult to work out what's going on. All these things are happening so fast. We have come to the end of our time this evening. I'm extremely grateful to repeat to Dalhousie University for once again hosting us here. And Frank, thank you personally as well for making this happen. Most especially, of course, I'd like to thank the panelists who've come, many of them come a long way. Tolu has come from Nigeria, Emily's come from Hong Kong. Roderick's come from Berlin. You've come from, I was actually looking up the distance. It's a pity, because this will work much better if you came from Vancouver. Because I looked up the distance. Actually, Berlin is closer to Halifax than Vancouver. So,
Robin, could I just say one word?
Yes.
I was backstage when I heard Frank's comments, and one of the really marvelous things about being a teacher is that you get to hear a comment like that. There's nothing more gratifying in life, I think, than having the opportunity to work with young people and be challenged by them, and then stand backstage and hear the kind of comment that Frank made. So a personal thank you, Frank, from me to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and join me in thanking the panel. Okay. And thank you for coming, and have a great evening.